Hello everybody, I'd like to welcome you along to our 15th Annual Australian Budget Review. This year's a very unusual seminar. It's the first time in our 15 years that we're not presenting it live to you in our various locations all around the world. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is COVID-19. It's limited our travel. I'm stuck here in Perth this year. And COVID's having a massive impact, not just on our presentation, obviously, but with the budget itself. It's seen it go from an expected surplus to a massive deficit, the largest in the history of Australia. And we're going to cover all that for you tonight and talk about how it might impact you and the property markets, and hopefully give you a very good insight from the comfort of wherever you're watching, at home or at office. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. As always, we have to start with a disclaimer just to make sure that you understand that this is just opinion, and if you want to act on any of this information, please seek personal guidance first. This is general in information and is for your courtesy and information, and it's not for you to act upon. Let's get stuck in, and as with every year, we'd like to start with the why rather than the what's, and we're going to look at what is the key agenda out of this year's budget. What are they trying to achieve? Well, obviously the first thing is to reinforce the fact that what they did during COVID-19 was indeed the appropriate action. The massive amount of spending, support and infrastructure programs were necessary to protect Australia from a health and economic point of view, and they feel justified in their actions past and now look forward to the next phase of recovery, which requires an even greater amount of spending. We're also looking at a situation that has never been experienced before, where everything has been simultaneously shut down across the world at the same time in magnitudes of industry that we've never ever seen before. As a result, the response needs to be equally commensurate and huge. We're also seeing that we must go as a jobs-led recovery, because jobs were the thing that was impacted first with COVID when everybody went into lockdown on a global basis. And we're still seeing massive impact in many industries as a result of those lockdowns. And the financial strength Australia came into this crisis has certainly helped to take the decisions it has, and also looked at being able to support the decisions it intends to make to get things back to as much normal as humanly possible. The Liberal government under Morrison and Josh Frydenberg believes this is the right plan for Australia, and maybe it is. Time will tell, because there's so much mystery still in the world today. Now, what we do have is a situation where COVID is letting them run loose with the checkbook and make decisions on spending like never before that are unlikely to be blocked by the opposition, because everybody is concerned that if they stop any momentum, things could get drastically worse, and everybody is afraid of blame of health changes, economic impact. So it's almost consensus to do whatever it takes to protect and to rebuild. And that's a very, very unusual circumstances, particularly in the Australian political landscape over the last 15 years. Every year I have a favourite quote, and this year's is Josh Frydenberg reminding everybody that he didn't have to introduce any new taxes or increase taxes to get all these stimulus through and do all this. Well, that may be true, but it's not really as powerful as normal, because yes, he didn't increase taxes, but by golly, it all came through debt. It wasn't funded expenditure, it was borrowed expenditure. There's a massive difference. Perhaps he's not sure what that means, but it seems to be necessary and could be the secret to Australia being the COVID champion of the world over the next few years. Let's start off with having a look at the numbers. And you can see here, last year there was expected to be a $7 billion surplus in this financial year 1920. It ended up being, in fact, $80-odd billion deficit. That is the biggest single turnaround of expectation to outcome ever in the history of Australia. The last time it was anywhere near this was obviously the GFC, when the Kevin Rudd government were predicting a $20-odd billion surplus and delivered a $50 billion deficit. So they've even beat Kevin Rudd's record during the GFC. The Liberals argue that COVID is a much bigger financial impact than the GFC, because the impact to GDP was greatly larger and jobs had to stop en masse immediately. GFC was a creeping giant that came along and affected financial markets and didn't affect people's health in the same way that this pandemic has. But to be able to make big decisions like closing borders, closing airlines, closing schools, putting everybody into lockdown for long periods of time, they were big, bold and brave decisions, and have had a serious impact on the economy in Australia, and we see it globally all around the world. Interestingly, receipts did drop, but not by as much as you might expect given the level of contraction. Now, part of this is because everything was moving very nicely prior to. Now, Australia started again under a little bit of financial duress around about December of 2019 as a result of a number of other events pre-pandemic, the floods, the fires, etc. But we were still on track financially for a reasonable surplus. That got blown out of the water with the pandemic, which crept in February, March, and saw the government having to support wages, etc. And hence we've seen this. Over $250 billion worth of pandemic expenditure is one of the reasons we've seen that surplus disappear and be replaced with a massive deficit. Interestingly, next year we're looking at an even bigger deficit, $200 billion. That's incredible when you think only just a few years ago we were talking surpluses, everything rosy. Next year, $200 billion, the largest single ever deficit Australia has ever had, and I would say hopefully ever has in the future. You certainly would not want to come back to that. Now, that is all funded by or caused by the effects of all of the pandemic issues, which we'll talk about later. Now, interestingly, I think revenue is going to only drop a little bit this financial year, which is not surprising because there were good revenue measures introduced in the budget. There was an expanding economy, and so revenue is still coming through to the government at a good pace, largely because of the way Australia has managed the pandemic and kept its economy in motion. We only had to do lockdown for a short period of time across Australia, and only Victoria has had to go back under a second wave. Expenditure, though, is blowing out massively. We can see from a 2% increase in expenditure last year, we're going to a 16 plus increase. And then in 2020-21, a 23% lift in expenditure. Now, some of that will be infrastructure projects, some of that is additional stimulus, but a lot of it is basically support packages to keep people gainfully employed, active in the community, and provide the social net that is required to keep everybody safe. That's an incredible human investment by the Australian government. Is it justified? Who knows? But we'll talk about how great the scale is. You can see GDP has contracted for the first time in a long time. Australia had the enviable record of a 29-year period without a recession. That record has now stopped. We will now be in the record books. It won't change anymore. 29 years of economic growth. That is now finished as a result of COVID. It had slowed before COVID because of the fires and the floods, but it certainly got blown away as a result of COVID. So it's how long will we stay in that negative growth and how quickly can we get to recovery? That's the whole intention and purpose of this budget. Unemployment is expected to peak at 8%, but it's currently sitting around 7s, and it's currently 7.25 is the estimate for next year's average. So they're hoping that all of this stimulus measure gets a lot of the people that did lose their jobs, hundreds of thousands of them, back into gainful employment very, very quickly. CPI has gone into negative this year, but is expected to bounce back to about 1.5% to 2% next year. So you can see everything is fundamentally on track. The scary thing is past the $200 billion deficit of next year is a further deficit of another $112 billion, then another 87, then another 66, and it's likely we will stay in deficit for many, many years to come until things have been able to normalise much, much better than they ever have been. We're going to pass a debt level in Australia of $1.1 trillion in and about 2024. And that will continue to rise if we don't get that budget back into balance or surplus sometime in the next 5 or 10 years. Now, interestingly, because interest rates are so low right now, the debt cost of that $1.1 trillion is about the same as the debt cost coming out of the GFC, which was about $18 billion a year, but on a debt of around about $540 billion. So with double the debt, we're not incurring currently any more interest cost. So that's one of the advantages, if you want to call it that, of the pandemic, is it's taken interest rates to the lowest they've been ever in the world, all at the same time across the globe. We saw in the GFC, the US kept their interest rates at these current levels of 0 to 0.25 for a prolonged period. They went back up, they've subsequently come down, but Australia was still relatively high during that period. The pandemic has taken rates from around 2-3% official down to 0.25% currently, which is unheard of in my lifetime. To give some perspective though, even though I believe 1.1 trillion is a horrible number for an Australian government to have as debt, especially considering that in about 2007 we were debt free. So we've gone in 13 years back to $1 trillion of debt. But to give perspective, that 1 trillion is approximately $40,000 Australian per man, woman and child living in Australia at the moment. If we compare that to our other country economic neighbours, UK has a debt of 54,000 Australian dollars per person approximately, and the US is about 90,000 Australian dollars per person. So comparatively, we do look quite well. And individually, when you consider you've got a $40,000 liability for living in Australia, that's probably fair value for the great lifestyle we have. It's just still frightening to have that much debt so quickly after being debt free. But that's just some perspective for us. What we are hoping to see is revenues go back to pre-pandemic levels in around about 23-24, where the government hopes that the revenue will go back to about $500 billion. Now, where that would have been into surplus, that's now just going to be minimising the damage of the ongoing deficits. To give you a quick idea, here is the graph showing what we were on track for in the light blue, and what the dark blue shows is the effect of the pandemic. So we've seen a massive deficit be recorded very quickly, and we're going to stay in deficits ongoing where we would have been theoretically in surplus positions. And you can see our debt ratio was in decline pre-pandemic, but now has had a massive jump. It has doubled as a result of the pandemic and is likely to stay high for a prolonged period of time. It may not be within 10 to 15 years before we can even start reducing the debt, never mind clearing it out completely. It may not even happen in our lifetimes. They all say, things could always be worse, and they probably could. If you look how Australia has fared in the pandemic, we went to a GDP minus of about 7%, and we're hoping to get back towards GDP growth in the very, very near future. Other economies, such as the US, have been double-digit declines in their GDP, and the UK in particular was almost 20% decline in GDP. So they certainly could have been a lot worse. And Australia also feels very well placed to recover that GDP growth back to pre-pandemic levels fairly quickly, because we were probably the best managers on the planet economically and health-wise of this pandemic. Just a quick recap of some of the COVID measures that have caused those enormous deficits. As I mentioned, $247 billion of initiatives, including the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and business cash flow support programs, which were almost half of that. Over $100 billion of support payments to keep lifelines to people that lost their jobs during the lockdown period in particular, and even ongoing in industries like the airline and hospitality at the moment. The airline industry got a further package of $700 million to help with surviving, because they're all grounded basically internationally and now limited capacity domestically. And hopefully that's going to start coming back as the state borders are relaxed. And of course, people were allowed to get early access to their superannuation, and they received some one-off income supports if you were on government packages. They introduced a $25,000 incentive at federal level to build a house if you could, for your owner occupation only. There's $750 million being spent on testing, $170 million keeping respiratory clinics open, $1.1 billion of additional specific COVID health funding for states, $111 million for telehealth, GP conferences online, particularly during the lockdown, over $500 million of aged care support, and $1.7 billion is now earmarked to go and buy 84 million vaccines if and when they become available. Now, this is a big issue in this budget as to if and when that happens. They're predicting that should occur somewhere around mid-year 2021. And the government has funded in these costs $1.7 billion to grab that vaccine and share it with all 25 million Australians at least once or twice. Now, it's going to be likely that a lot of things won't open up globally, never mind Australia, until that vaccine is released. So that is a huge gamble the government is making on when and if that will go. You've seen them already pre-advance the Cambridge vaccine. They're going to be monitoring a number of others, but that's what the world's waiting for, that magical vaccine to start everything back to some level of normality as quickly as humanly possible. And the only thing I know is we're closer to it than we were yesterday, but I'm not sure how close we are actually to it. Getting into the key elements of the budget, probably the flagship was the government had been in the prosperity times, flagging tax rate reductions for everybody and had legislated to bring in some additional tax cuts in about July 2022. As a result of the pandemic, one of the measures that they're doing is to bring back that date effectively yesterday on 1st of July 2020. So this financial year, these tax cuts will now be implemented. The opposition has already confirmed that they will support this package. This is worth over $500 billion over a number of years, but it's a massive change. We're seeing the 19-cent bracket move from 41 to 45, but importantly, the 32.5-cent bracket lifting from 90,000 to 120. So we're seeing that kick in and help out a lot. Medicare still applies and some low-income rebates are there, and we're still hoping to get those 30-cent bracket in the middle thing and the uplift to the higher end of 200,000 sometime around 2024, but who knows, that's a long way away in these unpredictable times. To give you an idea of the value of those tax cuts, if you're earning about $120,000, that's probably the peak value, that they're about $2,500 to $2,800. But whatever level you're on, at $40,000, it's about $1,000. So if you're a couple both working, it's potentially $2,000 to $5,000 of additional revenue per annum. That's going to be much, much needed. There's a lot of debate in the community as to whether this will be spent or whether it will be saved. I have an inclination that people will be using it to spend because they're going to need to do that. They're going to have stuff to do. And I think they're going to understand the importance of spending to stimulate the economy because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't spend, the economy can't grow, your job is not safe. If you spend, everything keeps growing and your job is better off and protected as a result of your spending. So do your bit, Australia. Get out there and spend your tax savings to the best you can. Get value, get perseverance, and get impact on your life, so don't waste it. Some of the other key issues, we're seeing $14 billion of additional infrastructure projects being announced. Now, this is on top of the previous $110 billion of ongoing 10-year program. So this is an enormous additional injection. They've been adding to this progressively, but this year bigger than ever, because of the impact of COVID and the need to get out there and create jobs, and infrastructure is seen as one of the key contributors. There's an additional $3 billion for what they call shovel-ready projects. So anything the state governments can do pretty much immediately, there's $3 million to help them get started and going. But importantly, if they do not get it moving, they will have that money taken back and reallocated to somebody that has got the readiness to get it into motion. There's hundreds of thousand jobs here that they're hoping to create. It's a massive stimulus, and hopefully we're going to get maximum bang for our buck. One of the problems we did see during GFC is there was a lot of money spent, but the value of that was sometimes a bit suspicious and the impact wasn't as great. Hopefully we're going to see important projects that impact our lives long time into the future. NBN is going to get a wake-up call with $4.5 billion of additional spending. It's been rolled out. They're going to look at how they can make that even faster than they currently are, but they have hit their rollout targets. The speed targets are now in question, hence the additional $4.5 billion to help do that. We're seeing an acceleration of the government moving to a digital platform. Hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be spent across all government departments to make things easier for everybody to get online, do online, fill in online, apply online, track online. So you're going to see Australia move very quickly into the modern age with a fully digitised government coming up. There's $1.3 billion to help manufacturing in modern industries like solar, etc., and try and get Australia back to work in the factory floor. It's critical we do that because otherwise we're going to be reliant on imports and it doesn't create enough jobs. So they're looking to see if we can do that. They're also going to fast track $1 billion of defence projects. Now this is not additional money, this is money that had already been earmarked but is going to be brought forward in timing. And so that's going to be well appreciated by those industries that can have some capacity and can fill. There's $1 billion going to the universities to help with their research grants. This is going to be welcome because they're going to have shortfall of revenue during this period because their overseas students are very difficult to come in. It's very, very hard to get approval to come in. The government hasn't really announced any policies to help the university out to bring those students back yet, but that's something we need to watch and monitor. And CSIRO is going to benefit from about $450 million of additional funding over the next 5 years to help them get projects into a commercial ready state and hopefully roll out. And Australia obviously has some great examples such as your Wi-Fi. You want to make sure that we are at the front of that technology boost. Some other tax initiatives, well obviously the personal tax cuts were the main initiative in regards to tax. Over $500 billion worth over the next 4 or 5 years. So that's the main element, but they're also going after businesses as a significant delivery point of expenditure. So there's an accelerated asset write-off, which has now been opened up to any business with a turnover of less than $5 billion, and is now an unlimited amount. If they replace machinery to whatever cost, they can write that off in full in the current financial year, where before it used to be progressively over a number. The cap used to be $30,000. Originally when it came in, it was $20,000, and then it was lifted to $150,000 as a COVID stimulus just recently, but now that cap has been taken off. Now that's important because during COVID, very few businesses had the cash flow capacity to take asset acquisition too far, and they were nervous because they were all holding the cash to see what happened and if it was necessary for survival. Now that we're seeing a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, this is probably going to be a more active investment option, and you should see a lot of businesses participate this, and hopefully that rolls out into the economy, creating lots and lots of jobs, lots and lots of economic activity, and lots and lots of economic prosperity. They're also giving an interesting thing where they're going to allow businesses to roll back tax losses as a result of COVID. So if you were a profitable business pre-COVID and you're now making a loss, you can go back and claim that loss against your previous tax years and get a cash refund of tax paid previously. Now that could be a little bit of a windfall for some businesses that are struggling now, and so they just have to get into the tax office as quick as they can once the details are announced and try and release that money. But that's going to certainly help out. They're not going to have to wait years and years and years to recover those losses against future earnings. They can go back into past tax returns and dive into the cash pot. There's also an additional $2 billion of research and development funding going in, which is critical. Again, we want to make ourselves a wiser economy, a more modern economy, and a more progressive economy. So that's very, very important. Jobs is what this budget is all about, and it has been the theme of this government right from when they first won the election in about a few years ago. And you can see they're focusing on this. So we're seeing JobKeeper, which was a very, very important initiative that meant people could stay with their employer, get government subsidy for the bulk of their wages. That's staying in. It has been reduced a bit, but it's been extended to March now. There's some better control measures on it, but that's going to be essential for businesses that are underperforming against their past year due to the impact of COVID, getting support to help themselves through. And there's a new job maker scheme coming out seeking to create 450,000 positions for particularly young Australians. There's a $200 a week subsidy if you are taking on an employee that is aged between 16 and 29 and was on government benefits prior, and $100 a week if they are between 29 and 35. Now already there has been rumblings that this should be extended to everybody because it disenfranchises the older. But the truth is the young are the ones that find it harder to start their careers. They need this help to make sure that they become taxpayers sooner than later and that they don't develop bad habits, bad cultures. The old already had some initiatives announced in previous budgets. They're still in play. So it's not as important, but it's critical. And the government is trying to obviously do a wide net of job creation, but it is targeting very specifically those young. It's also creating a wage subsidy for apprentices that are taken on. They're willing to pay 50% of their salary, 100,000 positions created there. And hence there's a supporting package in that manufacturing game. They need to get these people to work in construction, in manufacturing, in services. So it's a very big movement. The tax cuts critically are trying to unlock the spending power of the individual and the corporate. If those guys go and spend that money, those jobs will be safeguarded well past the subsidy periods. These subsidies usually last for between 1 and 2 years. So it's just as important for us to be thinking what will happen at the end of that period as it is saying, great, you've got a job today. But we need to make sure that there's enough economic activity, spending at consumer level to keep those jobs safe past the subsidy periods. And that's one of the key elements of those tax cuts. In terms of the environment, it's finally got a decent say. It's sad that it took a massive amount of fires, in Australia this last financial year to wake the government up to the impact of global warming. But it certainly is a little bit of a wake-up call, and it still probably isn't enough yet, but it's in the right way. One of the things that I've been complaining about for many, many years doing these budget seminars is the lack of funding for water. And this year, I'm happy to say, there's an additional $2 billion going into water infrastructure projects on top of the $1.5 billion previously announced in last year's budget. So that should see collaboration with states to create many dams and weirs, water pipelines, particularly in the regional areas. And that is long overdue and still the tip of the iceberg. We need lots more going in there. There's also $50 million for additional farmer storage. Farmers can apply for grants and get some stuff there. And then we're also seeing $2 billion of concessional farm loans for farmers that have been impacted by the droughts, which again have been long-standing and very, very devastating into the Australian farm community. So this will help them get through, hopefully improve, take advantage of all the other incentives and give them capital to rebuild, recover. I am happy to say in most areas at the moment, they're getting good rains. So we're finally seeing those droughts break, but we never know when they will turn back in the other direction. There's $269 million for the Murray River Darling to clean up that river, which again is essential. $50 million to help with ocean projects. $250 million is going into improving and creating a much, much better recycling system in Australia. And the government has made an important initiative to stop export of waste. So that we're now going to say, it's our waste, it's our responsibility, treat it here, recycle it here. And we're going to see Australia hopefully move towards the front of the queue in recycle performance. And this is the start of this at a $250 million investment. Again, very important, perhaps overdue, but happy it's arrived. There's $1.6 billion to go into additional R&D for renewable energy. The government wants to take that up and they want to hit their emissions targets. They're serious about this. Again, I'd be more happy if it was for delivery rather than just research, but it's better than nothing here. At least we're moving in the right direction and giving industry in particular, with the CSIRO and the universities, incentive to create technology that can change us. And that's what we need. So that's definitely a move in the right direction. And then there's $50 million to hurry up with some gas fields and replace coal-fired with gas as quickly as possible. Now, it's replacing one devil with another devil, but hopefully gas is the less of the two evils. But that's where the future lies, is gas, until of course we find out that might be a problem. But it's certainly going to be a solution to the carbon emissions, a solution to the energy cost. And Australia has an abundance of gas, one of the world's leaders. So having it there, we need to open it, use it, and make our economy and our environment better off for it. In terms of education and training, quite a bit. There's $300 million almost for 12,000 new undergraduate places. The government recognises that there may not be as many jobs out there. So if you haven't got a job, go to university. They are changing the makeup of the cost of universities. They're making things like law more expensive, maths and science less expensive, and that's a very, very smart and sensible strategy. We need more thinkers and not enough changers and doers. So let's see how that goes. There's $250 million for 50,000 short courses at universities. So hopefully, again, everybody looking to upscale, retrain, reskill can take advantage of that and make it happen. $146 million going into supporting education for disadvantaged kids. So this is right as early as maths and numeric studies at 5-6 years old, up to helping high school kids that are financially disadvantaged getting through and making it all the way along. There's $295 million for an enhancement to the digital employment services to make it easier to track, monitor, find a job through government portals. $183 million for a digital centre to cope with people that are unemployed, help them through, get their resumes, keep them connected and keep them engaged. $62 million for a local jobs program to ensure we're matching up people with their local communities and see how it goes. And women are getting a $240 million boost specifically for them, for mentorship, additional training and entrepreneur programs. Again, everybody is complaining that's not enough, but everyone complains in Australia that it's never enough. But this is a good start. It's a step in the right direction. Other announcements. Well, there's business insolvency reforms. The government has recognised that a lot of businesses are not going to technically be able to survive as they are, so they've made it easier for businesses to restructure their debt and continue trading, where in normal times they would be too insolvent and would have to close down. So they're trying to keep those businesses alive and let the creditors be more relaxed and more agreeable to continue on and let them trade out. There is an increase in your ability to get psychological support through Medicare from a maximum of 10 consultations up to 20 to make sure your mental health is there. There's $250 additional bonus to pensioners, which will be paid twice, once in December this year and once in March next year. There's $1.6 billion for 23,000 additional home care packages. Again, a lot of noise in Australia that this is not enough. Some of the industry bodies wanted 66,000, but this is a huge move in the right direction. I think 99,000 packages so far, and it's letting people stay at home a bit longer than necessary. And one of the issues with our aged care is, of course, that it's changing the nature. It's not, aged care, it's very much palliative. So the cost and the services required are changing greatly. So we can keep people at home longer. That is certainly economically better off for the government in particular. We're also seeing superannuation get some reforms in order to allow you to consolidate your super better. It's going to get harder for people to set up multiple accounts for super. You're going to be encouraged to keep one account for life, and they're also going to make superannuation funds that don't perform as well as they could or should to be forced to let their members know if they are underperforming and ensure that you are well informed about what's going on with your future savings. There's $200 million going into cyber security. Again, we saw earlier in the year, China allegedly was doing an attack. We've seen with the US, Russia and everyone going on. So cybersecurity is going to be the big industry of the new generation, unfortunately. It's just a fact, and the government has to keep pace with the need there. And then we're seeing extensions for people with visas, both temporary and permanent. If you had got a permanent residency visa and you're still overseas, you can extend it now without cost if you can't get into Australia. If you're already in Australia on a temporary visa, they're going to waive your renewal fees and extend your time. So they're being compassionate and understanding in that regard for as long as it needs to be under the COVID issues. Regionals are also getting quite a lot of money out of this budget, including a $50 million regional tourism scheme. Now this is also to help the fact that we can't go overseas on holiday in Australia. We have to go internal, so they want to encourage the city people to move into the regional areas and stimulate those economies and keep the money in-house. Not change our pattern of behaviour, still go and enjoy yourself, but enjoy yourself on Australian soil. Now, property's finally getting a little bit of activity, and some of the things that's going on is there's 10,000 more places this year under the government guarantee loan scheme. What that does, it allows owner-occupiers to be able to get a home loan with just a 5% deposit. Previously, you'd have to take a large cost mortgage insurance if you wanted a low deposit. The government is now giving a guarantee to negate the need for that insurance and make it a lot easier and more economical for first-time buyers to get in. This is an important role, and this is really a supplement of an affordable housing, social housing scheme where we can get people out of rental into ownership, particularly at a time when interest rates are so low in Australia. So this is a huge incentive and very, very well welcomed. Now, we're also seeing $1 billion of funding go into affordable housing to provide debt arrangements and lending to build more and more affordable housing in the community. $150 million for the Indigenous housing ownership program to get a local Indigenous population to become homeowners of themselves. And a follow-up, just a reminder of some of the schemes that the government put in place to support housing during COVID. They put $90 billion into the banks to ensure that the banks could give you a 6-month loan holiday if you were financially disadvantaged from losing your job, reducing your income during COVID. So they've taken a lot of money and put it aside there to protect the industry. We've also seen them allow that $25,000 builder boost, and that's available to any owner-occupier, first or second home buyer, and that's going to be available right till 31st of December. So expect to be a lot of activity leading up to December for people wanting to build homes in Australia. And that's, again, we need those jobs in construction very, very importantly. So that's a good activity. One of the key things, though, that's probably going to impact housing in Australia over the next 6 to 18 months is finally we're seeing the government get sensible on the lending rules. They're going to relax the rules about sustainable borrowing and get people that were getting knocked back on their home loans back into the approval basket. So that's a really, really big incentive, a really, really big initiative, and that should have a bigger impact almost than all of the other things. It's all well and good to say, hey, you should buy a house, but if you can't get a loan, you don't have the opportunity to do so. So this to me is probably one of the better things out of this budget in particular. Having a look at the Australian dollar, wow, what a crazy year that had. Not just normally, but COVID certainly had an impact. You saw the Australian dollar against the US dip under 60 cents for a while. And everyone was saying, hey, it's going to 50, it's going to 50. I never believed that. I thought it was unsustainable. The US economy was in worse shape than Australia. So I was not surprised at all to see it bounce back over 70, and it's sitting around 72 cents now. And that's probably what I think is a normal level. In previous seminars, I've always sort of suggested that I thought that 70 to 75 this year would be the normal range. So I was very, very surprised and disappointed to see it go under 70. It didn't make sense to me, so it's not surprising at all to see it back in there. So I would expect to see, due to Australia's stronger economy, lower debt level, and good response to COVID, that should stay a fairly strong currency for a while everybody else is sorting themselves out. In terms of population, it's always been one of the key elements of the property market in particular, and also one of the key elements of Australia's growth. It's been our secret of success of 29 years of economic growth. We've always had a population growth well above 1% per annum. Now, what's happening now is for the first time in a long time, that's coming to a very quick halt. And it's not because people don't want to come to Australia. At the moment, the government is not letting them come to Australia. So you can only get special permission to come in. There's still stranded Australian citizens overseas, never mind people wanting to come to Australia. Now, I do believe this is a bit of a bad program that the government's got going. We should be encouraging people to come to Australia to keep that economy growing, but using good COVID management techniques. Now, Australia has shown that it can bring in quite a number of people from overseas, and as long as they are managed in quarantine facilities, tested properly, and kept under control, there is little or no transmission into the local population. Now, we've seen in Melbourne where it goes wrong, and that was not well managed, and it got into the local population, it can go crazy. So we have the two extremes. We know what we can do with good management. We know the result of bad management. It should be up to the government at both state and federal level to be able to ensure the standards of that management are sufficiently high that Australia could take in the population that would grow the economy, create jobs, and stimulate things even during this crazy time. In fact, I think they should go as far as looking at making Australia a COVID sanctuary. Offering people that are worried in high COVID countries to come to Australia, live there for 6 to 12 months if they can fully fund themselves and prove they don't have COVID and satisfy a quarantine basis during arrival. And we could get those people coming to Safe Sanctuary with enough economic power to substitute for the loss in tourism and other elements. You can see our population growth is expected to fall to just 0.2% in 2021. Now, I'm not sure that number will come right because a lot of Australian expats came back during COVID, some 300,000 apparently. Now, the government's obviously expecting many of them to go back when they can, but many of them are in industries that will not recover for a while. So we might see them hanging around, hopefully a bit longer, like myself, here stuck in Perth. In 2021-22, still soft at 0.4. Bear in mind, we traditionally used to about 1.6 population growth. Now, a lot of that is due to the fact that in 2021 and 21-22, they're expecting net minus migration, from immigration. So births are still booming along at 150 to 200,000, but net migration is going from a positive of 150 down to a negative of 72. Now that's going to have a massive impact on the number of consumers, the number of renters, the number of owners, the number of spenders, the number of customers. So we want to really try and reverse that if we can, and that's up to the government maybe over the next few years to look at policies where with sensible management, particularly for vaccines on mark, particularly if we can do on-arrival testing, particularly if we get our quarantining right, to maybe keep increasing the arrivals up to a safer level that's good for the economy as well as protecting the health. In 22-23, the government is expecting things to start normalising. In this budget, they're expecting a vaccine to be available by about mid-2021. So once we've got a vaccine, they're going to start to see things normalise a bit, but it won't be straight away as usual. It'll take a while to progress towards that. But this population is going to be something to watch, something that Australia may have a strategic international marketing advantage. If we can manage it better than anybody in the world, which we have, maybe we can use that as a tool to attract high spending, high value, high economic input, COVID sanctuary people. Let's see how that space evolves. In terms of the property market itself, everybody was predicting the property market would drop 20 to 30%. Everybody except us. We didn't think that. And we thought that for a number of fundamental reasons, notwithstanding the government had put in the lending package, which was important to defer loans of anyone affected. The population had been strong. The expats coming back was strong. And we've always had fundamentally a balanced or short supply market. Now that's not to say we don't have pockets of real problems, particularly in Melbourne with the smaller apartments. They were massive oversupply beforehand, but were being filled up by students and short-term renters. Now both of those industries are absolutely savaged as a result of COVID. So we've seen that sector be absolutely demoralised and will take many, many years to recover. But overall, the general housing market has been surprisingly resilient. We saw in the quarter by quarter numbers that, believe it or not, people were more worried about Bill Shorten's changes to negative gearing and to tax, in last year's election than they are about COVID. We saw bigger contractions leading up to there of 3% last year when it was almost a guarantee that Shorten would win the election and everyone was concerned, where COVID so far in June quarter has only contracted about 1.8% nationally. So that's quite amazing that people were more concerned about financial impact than health impact, even with the economic overflow that both of those would bring. And as such, we've seen things very much stabilise. Now, since obviously June, things have got even more normal in all states in Australia except for Victoria. That's still having lockdown measures as we speak. So that's going to have obviously nervousness, but the rest are enjoying quite active periods in the property market because of a lot of returning expatriates, a lot of people seeking to upgrade their home and looking to be in the best place, take advantage of the interest rates on offer, which are the lowest they've ever been. So surprisingly, in Australia and globally, property has been a strong performer throughout, and I expect that to continue. If you want more detail, we did do a presentation on property issues as a result of COVID. I'd suggest you tune into that. But I'm going to say that I think the Australian market is going to stay particularly strong. Now, all of the markets have just been flat and subdued, understandably, given what's going on. But I think we're seeing bounce back pretty quickly, so I'll be very keen to see the September and the December numbers and expect them to be surprisingly positive. In terms of the overall from the Real Estate Institute, you can see that Sydney in the last quarter came down 2, Melbourne 3.5, Brisbane 0.9, Perth just 1. But everywhere is pretty much doing okay year on year. Perth was the worst year on year, but had been doing pretty well. But it's now the best value point in the market. And having been stuck in Perth now for the last 8-9 months, I can tell you physically, it's feeling pretty good in the property market at the moment. So I expect that to be a pretty quick recovery. There's some good incentives, not just from the federal but the state, across most places in Australia. Look for those, take advantage. Buy quality if you're buying property. Don't look for bailing out someone else's problem. Look for quality, livable, and you should be fine. And I think you'll find good comfort at Australian price points across the industry overall. One of the reasons I believe that strongly is, of course, the fundamentals. And you can see Sydney has the highest vacancy rate at the moment of 4%. It is a high-cost market. And again, it had a lot of property come on and people have been moving out of Sydney for affordability issues. So it's not surprising to see that creep up. But rents have stabilised there. They've come off a little bit during COVID, but they were rising prior. But everything is stabilised. Melbourne's vacancy is 2.8. That's still pretty high. It's creeping up. Brisbane is pretty good at 2.6, and Perth has turned around from what was the worst vacancy in Australia to now the best of the major cities at just 2%. You can see it's contracted by 0.9%. That's one of the first signs of a recovering market. So it also has been lately the highest searched property market in Australia. So expect Perth to be the dark horse and finally start making up some ground that it has on its high-performing eastern states cousins. So have a look for that. Finishing off, you'll be glad to note, in summary, I think that the highlights of this budget were very much that, water is going to get some activity. $2 billion for dams. It's been my call for ages. I can't see enough being spent in this. We all like to drink water. It's a necessary. Get it done. Keep building more. Great to see the environment. It's missed out, particularly in Liberal budgets for the last few years. It's good to see it starting to get first and foremost and front and centre. Happy to see that indeed. Youth getting jobs is always a good thing. We've got to create resilience. We've got to create opportunity for them people to find out what talent they can bring to the play and get them engaged in society more than they are currently. And of course, when we're spending money on infrastructure, that's a good thing as long as it's something we need. We've seen in the past at times we've gone and done frivolous things that weren't so necessary. It's critical we do forward-thinking infrastructure and make it big enough to last for a long time. I was watching an interview the other day and they correctly said, look at Sydney Harbour Bridge. They built it 8 lanes from day one because they wanted to future-proof it. These days we go build 4 lanes and so we've got to go add to it. Let's get the job done. Let's get it done right from the start, hopefully. And we want to see those tax reductions. They're a fantastic thing to see them come in. They're not new, they were already there. The fact that we've had to accelerate them is good, but let's hope that every Australian takes advantage of that extra money in their pocket to go out and stimulate the economy in their own little way. That's what's necessary. I hope you do your bit. And of course, we're seeing these stimulations for not just short term, but medium term as well. These subsidies on wages are year to 2 years. The apprenticeship schemes, long term. Infrastructure projects could take a few years. We need that to be elongated as much as possible to keep momentum going, and that's what we want to see. And it's probably a great thing and a very proud thing to say as an Australian that we've shown that compassion is more important than cost in this country. We did the right things to provide economic stimulus, to provide support, to provide health programs, to provide whatever it was necessary to keep people safe economically, mentally and health-wise during this pandemic. And we should all be very, very pleased at that, even if the outcome of that is a massively big financial hole that we have to then fill for the next few years. In terms of the lowlights, I think that the government's missed a mark here, that they don't have a plan B going on, in terms of how they should be managing COVID if it is going to stay with us. We're seeing, particularly at state level, that the only plan is to eradicate and stop it coming in. That is not a logical, sustainable situation. We have to be able to manage it in the community better than we have. New South Wales has done that quite well, Victoria not so. But WA, the extreme, where it just wants to keep everything isolated, that's not sustainable either. But we need to look at a national and state plan as how we can manage whilst that's out there. The vaccine will help, but we don't know if everyone will take it. So we need to have a plan B. I think we've missed a great opportunity to create Australia as a safe COVID sanctuary for anyone who wants to come and stimulate our economy with their spending and can show that they can support themselves, show that they don't have COVID and do the necessary isolation to ensure they come into the community COVID-free and helping us all out. That would have been a massive advantage. I think it's sad to see some of the particularly hard-hit industries such as the airline industry, tourism, entertainment and sport left out of this budget. I'd hope to see other announcements subsequent to the budget where they're going to be given specific encouragement, because those industries are still massively impacted on a large scale and didn't even get a mention in this budget. Okay, and obviously we've had hundreds of thousands of expatriates return, and there's nothing here to recognise their contribution and look at retraining options for them. They might take some of the places on offer, but I doubt it. But we need to look at those because a lot of them will be in industries that are impacted globally and can't go back overseas because there's no position waiting for them. So we have to find a spot for them somewhere in Australia and get them back contributing with the skills that they've learnt overseas. And we also need to look at, was spend the right policy at this time? I have no doubt that we needed to do it. The magnitude is going to be the point of contention over the next while. Should we have spent more? Should we have spent less? Time will tell. But the key here is, can we manage the COVID? If we get that vaccine, if we don't get the vaccine, what will happen? How we manage in that new COVID world, in mental application and acceptance of what to do, is going to be the critical element in the success or failure of not just this budget, but the Australian economy. Now, I'm also slightly worried that we're spending all this money and government doesn't have a great reputation on either side of Parliament as to efficiency. So I'd really like to see some strong safeguards put in place to say that if we are going to spend billions, let's get value for money. That's what we need in this country more than anything. And there's a preponderance to allow money to be spent and no one know quite where it went. So let's hope we get the best bang for our buck to stimulate our economy for the longest possible period. And of course, the biggest risk about borrowing as much as we have in this budget is that it's fantastic now while interest rates are cheap, but how long will they stay low? Now, the government's obviously banking on it staying low for at least 2 to 4 years. But let's hope that the interest rate market doesn't change too quickly too soon, because that's going to increase the cost of that funding from currently $18 billion at 0.25 to 1.5 up to 36 very quickly, 50, 100 billion. And then all of a sudden, you're chasing your tail federally trying to cover the interest, never mind pay off the debt. So it really, really relies on the world staying a low interest rate environment. Now, the only thing that's going to help with that is every government is in the same position. But if there's competition for cash, that usually can have a rising impact on interest rates. So let's have our fingers crossed that that doesn't come back and bite us too soon before we get our finances in order and get on with normal life. Overall, I'm giving this budget a 7.5 out of 10. It needs that sort of stimulus. It needs to get out there. It's looking at youth. It's helping the people that need it, and it's spending the appropriate amount on COVID success measures and COVID recovery measures. I hope that it all goes well. I hope the government develops a plan B, and I hope the vaccine becomes sooner than later, because I need to get to an airport. I don't know about you. On that note, I thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it gives you an insight and gets you thinking about how you can make your contribution to keeping Australia financially secure and a better place in a COVID-free or COVID-existing world. Thank you very much for your attention.